and indeed doesn't really have a teaching about the modern world itself and how it relates to it. How does the church find a position for itself within a secular society, a secular civilization? How is it anything different from a country club, a bowling league, or anything else that we might join? What is it that gives it a special stature, a special role, a special position in the order of things? It seems to be that it's only in the social area that it has managed to stake out this claim. And it's worth asking why indeed that has occurred, why indeed the social area is the one exception to the overall pattern here of sort of an inconclusively articulated relationship to the surrounding world. I think our preceding speakers, E.J. and Harold Meyerson, have done a rather nice job of summarizing and re-evoking the inspiration that's in the document, namely that it draws its entire moral strength from its focus on individual suffering, the suffering of humanity, the suffering of a labor class that at this time found itself, greatly disadvantaged, and that this is not something that simply disappears. That under capitalism, there is no guarantee that every component, every member of the society will find a just wage, a just outcome, and really a full human existence. The church, as E.J. mentioned, eventually comes through this tradition of social teaching to put itself on the side of the poor. That is a place and a focus in which the church comes to speak for the most defenseless, for those who are incapable of speaking for themselves, the invisible poor, as Harold Meyerson mentioned. I think that works rather well, and that indeed is an outcome that, as John Paul II mentioned, makes the church a specialist in humanity, which is another great phrase that comes up in this area. We begin to see, indeed, how on that basis the church enters into a public arena by taking its stand on behalf of the inexhaustible value and dignity and worth of each individual. This reminds us of you could say, the wider context of rights, of individual dignity, guarantees, and so on, that we're familiar with in terms of the more secular traditional language of liberal democracy. And let me move on to that area. The success of the social teaching of the church has not ultimately been matched by a similarly definitive expression of how the church relates to the secular and political world. There's no long tradition of reflection on these topics. They are sort of episodic. They occur from time to time in passing in individual encyclicals and so on. But increasingly, there is attention being turned to, you could say, the larger question of whether secular society has the resources within itself to survive, to really renew itself, to really find a way of understanding what it's about, understanding how individuals fit within the whole, and particularly in, you could say, upholding its own deepest inspiration. I think, for instance, of the debate that Cardinal Ratzinger had with Jürgen Habermas in 2004, in which they each seek to answer that question. And this is a larger question, I think, than simply questions of social justice or economic distribution or guarantees or anything else. It is the question of how indeed does the church, as a transcendent institution, contribute to, you could say, the process of clarification that goes on within secular civilization today. One of the reasons why that was an interesting exchange is that quite contrary to, say, Leo XIII's sense of being embattled, being on the defensive, being surrounded and so on, here we had, you know, a little over 100 years later, essentially a kind of friendly conversation, a conversation in which it's not just each side presenting their mutual critique, but a kind of meeting of minds in which Habermas, who was really the representative of enlightened secular rationalism, certainly not Christian, but not necessarily hostile to it. And we had Ratzinger, the future Benedict XVI, reaching out to that world that had previously seemed rather unfriendly, rather unwelcoming, and so on. And each of them wondering, to what extent do they depend on one another? To what extent does the secular world, in a sense, need the church? And if it does, how does it relate to that world? How does it find itself as a part of that world? Clearly, the tradition of social teaching, which is a tradition of the church carving out a moral authority by which it speaks to a world of which it's not really a part, already is in the background here. But the interesting thing about the discussion is that Habermas comes up with the notion that we are in, he says, not a secular age, but a post-secular age, which suggests that the secular world no longer sees itself as defining its limits. And indeed, it recognizes that the church is somehow necessary and indispensable to it, Christianity, faith, everything, the religion in general, that all of that is something that, even though the secular world cannot understand, it nevertheless needs, it nevertheless depends on. And that's not in any way a kind of resting point, I think, for the reflection. Habermas actually has another exchange with the Jesuits at the Institute at the University of Munich, in which his own piece is called An Awareness of What is Missing, which again is a curious formulation. If you think indeed about what is missing, this is what Catholic social teaching provides, and what the church in general provides. It is this sense that each individual is an inexhaustible center of meaning and value in the whole order of things. A A secular world, a world in which the market and rational calculations and so on ultimately determines the value of everything, clearly no longer works and clearly no longer makes sense, even to, you could say, the ordinary liberal terms of our own convictions. How am I doing? Okay. All right. Let me just sort of conclude with what I think is an interesting example of the call for solidarity. I know this will strike you as a little strange, but Warren Buffett wrote last year a letter to the New York Times in which he thanked his uncle, in this case his Uncle Sam, for what it had done in the financial crisis. And he has an extraordinary line in that letter in which he says that at that point, when the whole world sought to become liquid, you, Uncle Sam, were the only one available to take the other side of the transaction. That other side of the transaction is really an example of solidarity in operation. Politically, the political expression of solidarity is, after all, the point at which we, as a political community, recognize who we are, what we're about, that we're bound up with one another, and that indeed it's not simply a market of individuals pursuing their own interests. We're back at the very seminal formulation that you had in Rerum Novarum, that labor and capital depend on one another. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions, so if someone has some questions, there's a microphone in the middle of the floor. I'd encourage you to walk to the microphone so that we can get this recorded.
Bishop John McCarthy, who was a protege of Monsignor Higgins, who's also a dear friend of mine. I'd like to say that I have been involved in prison reform for 40 years, and I can count on my hand the number of times that I've been to many, many meetings where there has been union representation. And I don't know the reason why, and that's the question that I have. Maybe I should bring it up to Mr. Sweeney. I have brought it up to Mr. Sweeney. It has been just, we have now, as people know, 2.3 million people in prison. We have a reentry movement where the unions should play a major role, and they are AWOL. They're absent without leave. And certainly they're not in the spirit of Rerum Novarum. So the question I have is, why do you think this is true, and how can this be changed?
Thank you.
In some ways, I think you should go talk to Jerry Shea after this meeting, who will answer that for you. Harold, do you have a... Well, I think these mics... Okay. And there is a further complication that in many states, prison guards are unionized and are not necessarily, by virtue of their very job, going to be leading the charge for, reducing the number of people we incarcerate, which is absurd. This is almost the American de facto form of social policy, is mass imprisonment. But again, Jerry or his
former boss John Sweeney might answer that better than I.
Good morning. My name is Li Yang.
Could you get closer to the mic so we can hear you?
My name is Li Yang. I think it's a very inspiring session, but I just wonder if you can really sort of take a little bit more proactive approach so the church members or religious group can be more visible, because I think in a lot of activities or elections, and church members or religious group, they talk saying pro-life, so they ignore or separate from all other social issues. And you can see in solidarity group, you can see some reverends or some bishop, they can really see in the microphone in a big protest, but there's no protest sign. They say from a Catholic university. You know, there are some Brown University, there are some Yale University, but there's no such things as a religious group. They can say, we religious group really support the laborers, really support the people's right, really support the laborers' right, and all the people, their property or their life or their freedom should be protected, so they can have this people united, except maybe now from the Wisconsin and from SB 1070, maybe we have a little bit of Russian in this, but we have to be more proactive. Have all the church members and religious group say up front, because they really take a lot of influence.
Could I respond to that? Is this mic on? Yes. Yeah. Because first of all, I agree with the thrust of the question. And I agree with it in part because I worry very much that the emphasis on the church's social teaching in public pronouncements by the bishops and others connected to the church has been on the decline pretty much since the 1986 bishop's letter. Now, it does not mean that the church has not spoken powerfully on these issues. And indeed, the bishops issued a very strong statement on what was going on in Wisconsin. And I have to acknowledge my old friend John Carr, who's over there. Many of you know, I can't resist telling one of my favorite John Carr stories of John being at a bishop's meeting, has a big bishop's sign on. You know, the woman on the elevator says, "John, are you a bishop?" He said, "No, I work for the bishops. What do you do for the bishops?" And John said, "Well, actually, I work on peace and justice issues." And the woman in the elevator looked at John and said, "Well, John, you're not doing a very good job," she said to him. And I have always thought of that not as a rebuke to John Carr, but to all of us. And it's in some ways why I think I'm not alone in this. I mourn the fact that Cardinal Bernardin's Seamless Garment, which sought to connect human dignity from conception to natural death, really was a way of talking about the church's social tradition in all of its richness. And I very much worry that while the statements come out, and John always reminds me of that, my students, for example, at Georgetown, who are very well instructed, they're really smart kids, the student I cited who went back to Rerum Novarum is actually the exception. And we've had conversations in class where a lot of the students don't hear much about the social teaching of the church in their parishes or in CCD instruction. And I don't, whenever I say this, I know, having 3 kids of my own, how hard it is to do religious instruction these days. And so I'm not, I don't feel like being critical of anyone in particular, but I think the tradition is lost. We are in danger of losing this, and that's why I told the story of Harold and my friend at the Baptist school, because sometimes I have found that our non-Catholic friends are actually better educated in our tradition in these matters sometimes than we are ourselves. So I hope we will hear more moments of witness and in a louder voice, and not have the Catholic Church become defined by a small piece of its social agenda, but by the richness of the whole social agenda, which I think is what we're celebrating when we celebrate Rerum Novarum.
Let me say, we have about 3 or 4 minutes before we need to clear for the next panel. Go ahead.
somewhat tie into that. I think Michael Gerson had written a column a month or so ago expressing hope or optimism or wishful thinking that the many House Republicans who were Catholic would, Catholic social teaching would in some way influence how they, their decision making and what they vote on. And I'd interested to know if you think that Catholic social teaching will influence how the House Republican Catholics will legislate.
I read, that was a wonderful column Mike wrote, and I read it as a prayer. And I really mean that. I mean, as many of you know, Mike is a very, very religious person. He's a Protestant. He came to speak to my students at Georgetown, and I said, this is a person who seems on the road to Rome somehow, as after you read that column. I don't want to put words in Mike's mouth, but I think that column reflected the fact, I think he's written this, that he is very upset that a certain kind of conservatism, which we might call compassionate conservatism, is on the decline, being replaced by a different form of conservatism that is less sensitive than people like Mike would like it to be to the suffering of the very poor. I mean, if you go back to George W. Bush's speeches, no one, I think, no political candidate has quoted Pope John Paul's social teaching more than George W. Bush, and I think a certain person named Michael Gerson had a lot to do with that. But I do think on some of these questions, particularly related to poverty in the third world, if anyone can persuade some of the new Republican conservatives that this ought to be part of their agenda, it's our friends in the religious conservative movement. And so I hope that they are there. And I think Mike, in a number of columns, has been calling both Catholics and Protestants to their responsibility in that area.
Yeah, my name is Pat Malloy. I'm an adjunct professor at the law school and teaching international economic regulation. And I'm always struck by the Pope Benedict has put out a very, very powerful encyclical talking about globalization. And in essence, what he's saying is we're driving down the standard of living for most of our population, in particular our working class people, in the name of increasing shareholder value. And that this is, which is in turn being driven by hedge funds. He's really laid out a very good critique of what is happening. And I never hear anyone in the church, I've sent this to my pastor and I've sent it to others, and I never hear anyone talking about this. And this is the most powerful thing that really needs to be talked about in this country as part of why we're in such political turmoil. We're driving down the standard of living for our working class people at a very rapid pace. The Pope has analyzed it, and yet the church doesn't talk about it. I'm really surprised. I wanted to get your opinion, maybe Mr. Walsh and others, why that is happening.
Well, I'm not sure that I can give you a very good answer to your question, but I'll try. As I read this whole succession of encyclicals, including the ones by Benedict, what strikes me is that the Church has moved more and more away from specific policy recommendations. I mean, what do we do about a global economy that advantages some and disadvantages others? How would we address those things? Well, I mean, there's a range of solutions, one of which would be to stop trading altogether, exit the global economy, and have everybody, including much of the developing world, crash to much lower economic and social existence. I mean, not every problem has a solution, and it's not every, and it's not. I wouldn't say that the Church necessarily has a solution for every problem. A good deal of just empirical humility is very often required to find a way of overcoming these issues. And over time, I mean, if you think of this problem as a problem that existed within the industrialized developed world at the turn of the century, over time, that has been addressed through the development of a safety net, through the development of regulation, government intervention, and all of that. We have something similar in the world economy through international agreements, the World Trade Organization, all kinds of other international bodies that piece by piece and over time generate ultimately, even the world community, the world is a community. We cannot have a part of it that develops at the expense of the rest. And that logic has an inexorability about it that will, in the end of the day, drive it. It's obviously good for the church to call attention in general to those terms, but I wouldn't want the church running the world.
Well,
Could I just say something briefly, because I think I wanted very much you to get in there. Well, one of the reasons I referenced Father Larry Snyder's book is it's the first systematic effort I know of in book form to take the recent encyclical by Benedict and ask, what does this mean for us now? And I think it's a really good effort on Father Larry's part. Secondly, I think, and this, I want to kick this over to Harold on this, among the problems with globalization are the fact that while there is a case to be made that globalization is capable of raising living standards in very poor countries, I think the people among those most challenged by globalization are the least privileged in the most privileged societies. And that's the problem that we have not grappled with effectively. And not all of the rich societies have our levels of inequality. There are responses to this. And I agree with you entirely that Benedict's teaching on this really should be addressed, thought about more by Catholics in the U.S. And elsewhere. And I think it's a problem of our categories. Everybody, the standard rap is Benedict is a conservative pope. Well, in certain ways he is. But he is in some ways a classic, if you will, Christian Democrat of the left. And I viewed this as a kind of left-center Christian democratic document about the economy. And I hope people spend more time with it. And, Larry Snyder, by writing that little book, was issuing an invitation to Catholics to engage it.
Well, far be it from me to comment on Catholic doctrine, but if there ever was an institution which by its very definition transcended borders and dealt with transnational questions, it is the church. And so I think it is not that great a leap for the church to be thinking not only in the terms that Pope Benedict laid out in that encyclical, but take it a step further. There are rules that can govern the economics of globalization or not. And if you believe that there are more or less humane ways to structure the process, then I think there's a course that's clear. We have one example, which has been shaky for a variety of reasons, of transnational integration, and that's the European Union. Now, apart from the whole issue of is Greece busting its budget, Spain, et cetera, Ireland, you have social charters, they are called, that there are rights that workers have in any country within the European Union, that there are certain minimum standards that need to be observed, enacted transnationally. It's not like the church hasn't had its own version of the European Union, many hundreds of years ago. The Holy Roman Empire didn't have those rules, and it was a bit of a fiction. But there is nonetheless an inherently transnational aspect to the church that could put it, I think, if the receptivity was there, not only in line with Pope Benedict's encyclical, but with the notion that the indivisibility of human dignity and of workers' rights can affect the terms of globalization as well.
Could I say one last thing? I just want to, I'm so grateful for the folks who are here, both the learned clergy and learned theologians. And Harold mentioned Mike Harrington. And I just wanted to offer you an invitation, which in a way Mike offered at the end of his life. And it's one of my favorite Mike Harrington stories. I was having lunch with him, and I can't remember if it's his cousin or his sister who was a nun. And Mike always remained very deeply engaged with religious questions. He had been in the Catholic Worker. And Mike said that he had talked to his sister or his relative, the nun, and he said, look, I don't believe in God anymore, so I don't believe there's a heaven. But if God lets me, if God exists, I believe he will let me into heaven. And if he does let me into heaven, I will look at God and say, why must you mumble? Which I believe is the most profound religious insight I have heard. As you know, the reading last Sunday was about St. Thomas the Apostle, whom has always been my hero. I think he's the patron saint of journalists, show us the evidence. And so I invite you all, for those of us who struggle and pray for faith, that somebody here write a book or give a sermon on the theme, why must you mumble? And I think that we are inspired to faith by discussions like this and by achievements like Leo XIII. I just thank you all for having us here today.
E.J. Dion, Harold Meyerson, David Walsh, thank you very much. We're going to take about a 10-minute break and reconvene here for the next panel. So 11:30, reconvene here.